Hello, everybody. This is Daniel Karapkin. I'm speaking to you from Toronto, Ontario. I'm the rabbi at the Bayit of Thornhill, and it's wonderful to be able to engage with you once again for a very worthy organization, Amudim, which is doing such important work throughout North America and beyond for Klal Yisrael, especially helping the most vulnerable of our population. It is a tremendous honor to be able to engage in a conversation with Dr. David Pelcovitz, who is no stranger to Amudim, nor is he a stranger to anyone most likely listening or watching this presentation. Dr. Pelcovitz is the Strauss Chair in Psychology and Education at Yeshiva University. He is usually one of those go-to voices that our community goes to when we are facing issues of crisis or tragedy, God forbid. We typically turn to our healthcare professionals, and Dr. Pelcovitz really represents the klal, the tzibor, in helping us heal, in helping us cope and come to terms with some of the very, very difficult issues facing our community and society in general. Dr. Pelcovitz, welcome. It's really an honor to have you here with us for Amudim.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and especially an honor to be here with you, given how much I've always learned from your role in leadership, and then addressing all the concerns that we'll be talking about in this program.
Thank you. We are going to be discussing a topic that I believe is dear to your heart, which is putting things in perspective in a polarized world, going from Fomo to Jomo. Could you, Dr. Pelcovitz, please elaborate on this theme, please?
Yeah, sure. There's been a real shift in the world in recent years. It's been going on for a while, but it's basically a feeling that social media has become, especially in younger kids, has become such an incredible force, shaping everything from self-concept to anxiety levels to one's core sense of identity. And more, I've had parents and adolescents and kids even, approach me and ask, I feel that I'm too dependent on Facebook, I'm too dependent on Instagram, on TikTok, and yet I can't seem to get off of it. It makes me sad, it makes me anxious, and yet I feel pulled into it. Can you give me some strategies for trying to get better control over this?
All right, and what are the besides the addictive behavior? What is some of the negative fallout that we're seeing when people's realities are defined by what they perceive themselves to be and others to be on social media?
Well, it can often be a false, superficial kind of identity that's based on everything that we know is superficial and cannot be associated with an enduring sense of well-being. As an example, even going to the point of what do adolescents or even younger kids fantasize about nowadays? They often fantasize about being famous. They often fantasize not necessarily about being good and giving people, but about what do I need to do in order to get the most possible likes on my various social media accounts. And it's not surprising that in studies that have been really getting much more publicity just in recent months, we're finding increases in serious kinds of emotional disorders, especially given COVID. So you have that as well. So there's a rise in depression, a rise in anxiety, a rise in kids, especially girls, having poor self-concepts. and even to the point of increases in suicidal ideation and even suicidal attempts.
All right. So, how do you, as a therapist, as a guide, the topic is going from FOMO to JOMO, going from fear of missing out, right? This need for celebrity, this need for being part of the popular group, and you say JOMO, which is going from joy of missing out, and especially with young people, how do we change that perspective, given that so many of our kids are using social media and many of our adults as well?
Yeah. So for both, because adults, I these programs are designed to maximize getting that dopamine hit. They're designed to addict us. So what we need to do is we need to come up with some strategies for mindfully disconnecting, for increasing awareness. And I have some specific recommendations that I think it probably makes sense for us to talk about some of the strategies. I'll start with just as an example. Let's talk about strategies for uninterrupted socializing. So strategies for uninterrupted socializing, with some of the authors on this, there's a wonderful book called The Distracted Mind by Ghazali, Gazzaley, and Rosen. And what they break down, which others since then have talked about also, is just as an example, the following approaches. Okay, so number one is the goal. You need to know what's your goal. If your goal is to be able to talk to people in an uninterrupted way, with our eyes bouncing off of the person you're looking at's eyes, our hearts bouncing off each other, so the goal in this case might be to keep your phone in the pocket when in one-on-one conversation with another person. Kids and parents tell me that this is something that they would love to be able to focus on and to work on. Having that goal go from the unconscious to the conscious makes a big difference. It says in Proverbs, it says in Mishlei, "Be'ein chazon yifara'am." Without that vision thing, you kind of fall apart. And that's number one. Okay, is just to put it on. And in fact, when certain communities have had programs to foster getting better control over this topic of use of phones and social media, this was one of the main things that kids very much appreciated and wanted more of when whole communities made up their mind to make this into something that's front and center. The second area would be, as an example, is clarity, which is basically, it's called metacognition, which is the need to, which is a fancy way of saying, why is this important? You have to get to the emotional, get into your heart. Why is this important to you? To recognize that these devices can reduce our own empathy. According to research, it not only reduces our empathy for others, it reduces our perception of how empathic others are to us, which is an incredibly important kind of thing to keep in mind.
Social media tends to sort of objectify other people, does it not?
Yes, and it does it in a way that is really very, very alarming. It tends to polarize things. So we see the other as being evil and horrible, and somehow, there's some very recent research that shows that tracks things over time, and they find that families are now spending less time at Thanksgiving dinner than they used to, because there's so much tension over differing political views. So you're bound in any typical family to have Democrats and Republicans, in the case of the United States, dining together. And it's fascinating, but they've actually tracked it and show a pretty significant dropping in the amount of time, so that the meals kind of end earlier than one would expect. And it's amazing that they have this data now. So that's just one simple example of it.
Well, if I could just follow up with that for a moment before you get to the next point. Recently Facebook was accused by a number of people who came forward and said that they were creating deliberately polarized communities on social media because their marketing data told them that when people get an emotional rise off of reading something on social media, they tend to become more engaged, will stay on longer, and may even buy things that they see in the ads because they're so emotionally riled up. This is very disconcerting, of course, if it's true. We're not going to convict Facebook in this discussion, but this is certainly something that we have to be careful about. If people are deliberately manipulating me emotionally to get a rise out of me and to start hating or disliking somebody else, that's probably bringing out the worst in me, is it not?
Yeah, look, all of these, social media sites, their financial model, as I understand it, is partly based on maximizing hits, maximizing time on the site, and maximizing, in many ways, the negativity and the polarization. That keeps things going. It's part of what, it's like, and I'm sure any rabbi, somebody in your position, what do how would you maximize the likelihood that you're going to grow your membership and grow the passion of people attending your shul have? It's probably going to be by really reaching them in their hearts, and giving those kind of classes and having those kind of programs and those kind of speeches. That's what they do. And I don't think it's coming necessarily from an evil place, but it's often coming from a place of really not necessarily, prioritizing what's best for their customers. And again, I don't want to, I certainly have no right to and no expertise to, but certainly what that whistleblower has shown in those congressional hearings has made that very clear. Let me just because I didn't talk about it a second ago, let me just take a second to review with you some of this stuff. Here's just a quick summary of some of this stuff. Is that the echo chamber on various social media platforms, it's designed in a way that it empowers status-seeking extremists, so that people who aren't extremists, people who are just talking in a very in much more moderate kind of way, their voice tends to be drowned out, and they tend to become quiet, because if you become too vocal on these sites, people come after you.
Yeah.
And they may threaten your safety. So there's a tremendous tendency for the discourse to become not only filled with personal attacks, but sometimes real threats on the safety of the person. And listen to this: those who deactivate their Facebook accounts report feeling happier. Okay, that's great. Okay, not surprising. But in the case of millennials, in the case of people who were born into a world where they already had their iPhones, they typically reopen their social media accounts very soon after. They find they just can't. They can't do it. They can't do it. It's so much a part of their identity and how they deal with their emotions and how they get their news, so that it becomes something that there's a true addiction to. So, when it becomes woven into the fabric of their identity and is their main news source, and to just expand it a drop, there's evidence that our political discussion networks have been shrinking in recent decades. This is before, some of the elections, the recent elections in the United States, but it's been shrinking. And which means that, there's all of this sense of polarization, but there's a fascinating new study it's a book that just came out a couple of weeks ago that is amazing because he makes a very strong case that much polarization is false. Social media exaggerates the polarization. And people, when they sit down and really talk to each other and hear each other out, are much more likely to be able to maybe change their views and be open to others' views. The name of the book, and again, I can't emphasize enough how it's totally changed my perspective on these things, because it's a man by the name of Dr. Chris Bail, Bail, and it's called Breaking the Social Media Prism. And what he shows with very, very well done research and all kinds of, a large team and, very respected kind of ways of getting to his conclusions, is he comes up with specific ways of trying to help us see things through the eyes of others without letting the false polarization that happens with the extremists online take over. So
Well, that's great for a person who's going to read that book. But getting back to getting back to how we solve the problem, and you correctly identify this idea of FOMO, that millennials who sign out of their account can't, they're chalishing. They have to get back on. So how do we address this with, you and I remember what life was like before the internet, but so many of who are our children's ages and are certainly our grandchildren's ages, how do we get them to unplug? So you had mentioned the importance of keeping the phone in your pocket and things like that. What else can we do?
Sure. So we already talked about the power of goals, the power of clarity. The next thing is a very simple behavioral intervention. There's nothing quite like it. The Talmud tells us that if somebody has a gambling problem, sometimes the best thing you could do for it is break the dice. This is going back over the millennia. Break the dice. Amazing how topical that kind of wisdom is. So here on the accessibility end, it's removing all phones from areas of interactions. So you could set tech breaks for checking your phone every 15 minutes. Families can have tech-free zones. And I know this is trite, but it works. So you have a very clear rule at home that parents and kids recharge their phones every night in a public part of their house. And if there's an emergency that comes in, which is what kids are very worried about, they'll be able to check it, at another time. But they have to, once they keep it in a public place, they're going to start to get a lot more sleep, and they're not going to be so hooked onto what becomes this overarching need to check over and over again. The next thing you have to have a strategy for dealing with boredom. Sherry Turkell, psychologist at MIT, a brilliant woman, she wrote a book called Reclaiming Conversations. And what she found is that nowadays, the kids who came of age after the iPhone was developed, they have a very hard time with their anxiety about simple conversations. There's a high level of social discomfort in adolescents and young adults. And she calls it a flight from conversation. And she says sometimes, in extreme cases, parents could really help their kids just to review the basics of social skills training. How do you start a conversation? How do you continue a conversation? How do you show that you're really listening and paying attention? You have to build up that muscle. Many kids who came of age after COVID was already in full force never even developed. If you look at preschoolers, the ability to have the give and take of conversation. Here, many kids who were born, who were, millennials, they have to, in a conscious way, develop. And you don't have to turn into a social skills training expert, but it might be helpful to be able to just talk to your kid about it, model for them, how to do it, model for them by talking to your other family members about this stuff. And that could be helpful. And then the final thing is anxiety, which is, there's a tremendous amount of anxiety over how are others going to see me if I shut off my account for a couple of hours a day. Let's say I'm driving. You have a kid who's old enough to be driving. They get very nervous that if their friends are texting them or in a crisis, that if they don't answer them right away, that they're going to be viewed as not being present. So there are simple strategies for the cultural change that can educate kids to know that you don't have to always be on call. You don't have to answer texts immediately. I find that that you have to really teach kids that. I'm available, and you could put it on your away message and it can make a difference. And I think I'm finding that kids are beginning to be more and more open to that because they're exhausted from always being on call.
I want to get back to that anxiety issue in just a moment, but I guess I have an overarching question that I've noticed of late. My upbringing is very different from the way that I brought up my children is very different from the way that I see some younger parents bringing up their children today. And I'm wondering if all of these strategies, assume that a parent takes into consideration the fact that I am the parent, you are the child, and I will guide you and show you what is best for you. And I hope this is not too far off topic, but it's certainly something that's been gnawing at me. I see so many parents today who show so much derech eretz to their children that they feel that their children should be in control of their emotions, of their behaviors, and put their child on such a pedestal that they don't feel that they can or should interfere in their children's behavioral patterns. Let me just give you one example. There was a parent who brought over one of their children to my house the other day, and I was taught that when a guest comes into your home, the guest is supposed to you as a guest are supposed to look at the host in the eye, shake their hand, say hello, make eye contact, all of these things that I was taught as a child. And today it seems like some parents feel that no, we have to be considerate of a child's feelings. And if the child doesn't feel like making eye contact because they're moody or they're in a bad mood, we have to respect that in the child and let the child go off into the corner. And when the child is ready to come and make eye contact and to be engaging, we allow the child to do that. And so part of me is concerned that if these solutions that you're advocating, Dr. Pelkovitz, they sound like wonderful solutions, but they assume that a parent is going to be sort of laying down the law for their children and saying, this is what is necessary, and this is what you should be doing, and this is what you shouldn't be doing. And part of the concern that I have, and I believe perhaps part of the anxiety that children have today, is that they haven't been given specific parameters or sufficient parameters to know the difference between right and wrong. Am I crazy or?
No, you're not crazy at all. I think it's the challenge of our generation. Kids, what my understanding of healthy parenting is about, it's exactly what the Talmud tells us. You find the balance between the left hand pushing away while the right hand brings closer, right? Between smoldocha and mimkareves. You need the balance between love and limits. And that's exactly what modern psychological research tells us and what the wisdom, the ancient Jewish wisdom tells us. And kids can't thrive without that balance. So all love and no limits, kids grow up to be totally spoiled and overindulged, and you could cripple a kid like that. They're not going to be ready to function in the world if you have an extreme like that. All limits, no love, rules without relationships equals rebellion. Okay, so you need to find the balance, and that's the art of parenting, and it's going to be different for every one of your children because every kid has a different temperament. And parents, I think, you see, the part of the challenge is many of the parents that I believe you're referring to, they're already, they were raised this way. So they hadn't necessarily had the role models that, that people who grew up, in a less complicated world, had as a matter of course. And it's interesting, if I could just stay with this for a minute. I think that there is something I hear often from people who I saw in my practice 30 years ago, 40 years ago. I've been doing this for a long time. And now they're parents, sometimes even grandparents. And they come to my office and they'll turn to their parents and say, why did you let me do this when I was a teenager? Why did you let me go into Manhattan when you knew that there was a crazy club scene there? Why did you let me basically, have a limitless American Express card? Why did you do all of this? And they get angry about it. And there's a beautiful thought in the Medrash that says the following. It says, this is from Mishlei, from Proverbs. Yaser bincha ki yesh tikva, vel hamiso al tite nafshecha. Put limits on your kids. There's always hope. And don't pay attention to their yelling and screaming and going crazy when you do the limit putting on them. So listen to this ancient wisdom. It says, Kol hamosif av yisurin al beno, mosif haben ahava al aviv. The more a parent puts limits on his or her child, the more that child will love the parent. And that's so true. But parents, there needs to be a real, by the way, one more thing. I find that when there's a massive community effort to address this, parents are open to it because they themselves recognize that something has to be fixed. Something that there's something off here, and I think they're nervous about it.
And yet, we can quote Mamore Chazal to demonstrate that parenting requires us to place limits on our children and show them where the lines are. And yet, a lot of very frum young adults who are parents are not going to the age-old wisdom of Chazal to derive knowledge about how to parent. They're going to the conventional wisdom that they're watching on social media and in the books that they're reading about how you have to validate your child's feelings and give them the emotional freedom to be able to learn about themselves and to appreciate themselves. And to me, this represents a major disconnect because we look at the Torah for guidance for all areas of our life, except for the parts where we don't look for guidance, for those things which we feel we've advanced beyond the Torah. And this it's sometimes quite frustrating for someone in my position as a spiritual leader who sees people sort of cherry picking the lessons that we can draw from the Torah, and then the parts of the Torah that we've moved past, perhaps. Obviously, there are certain things that are anachronistic about the book of Mishlei, which talks about not sparing the rod. And we don't exercise corporal punishment anymore. We recognize that that's not helpful and not the best way to parent. So we've learned to reinterpret it and to reframe it as not literally a rod, but rather as a way of disciplining, sometimes harshly disciplining when necessary. But how would you? And perhaps I'm putting you in an unfair position. This is really more a rabbinical question than a psychological question. But how do we impress upon the young members of our community that the Torah is a holistic guide for how we're supposed to live our lives?
Yeah, it's an alarming development to hear what you're seeing in the front lines over there. I think that it's let me tell you about a program that took place in Cleveland and in Chicago. And since then, it's been replicated in different parts of the world. And it was on this topic. The rabbinic leadership who were behind the Citibank, Citi Field Asifa in the Mets Stadium a number of years ago, where they say we have to ban the internet. They very much to their credit recognized we blew it. We blew it. It was a big mistake. You can't, this is here to stay. We have to find the balance, like Rav Hirsch said, between isolation and inoculation. So the community got together, and they had some generous funding, and had, in the case of Chicago, which was the first community that did it, they brought in the two leaders behind the original internet Asifa. And they brought them into Chicago. They invited the whole spectrum of the community, from the more modern to the most yeshivish and Hasidish, etc. And they put up a massive, massive site just for that day. And it had an incredible response, because what they talked about was small steps, very small steps. You're talking to somebody, put your phone in the pocket. You're having dinner, find, X amount of interruption-free time. You're, just simple things. But they made it a community effort. And it was a community effort where not only did they bring mental health people to come in to speak, but they brought rabbis to come in and speak who had, some deep insights of their own and were known to be open to the realities of the outside world. And a totally unexpected thing happened. The kids who were there loved it so much that they asked for another meeting, and they wanted more. They said, something, we've been dying for this. We've been dying for this. Now, to get to your specific question, okay, but what do we do about the fact that people are sometimes, even people more to the yeshivish end are sometimes seeing the world has changed in a way that you don't necessarily have to pay attention to rabbinic wisdom, instead of pay attention to people who are coming more from a scientific or parenting experts or whatever. I think the best way to change perceptions is it needs to be done, I think, in a massive community level. So here you had the whole community involved. A tremendous amount of work went into it. They did follow-ups. They were still doing things that are tied to this. And from the last I heard, it made change that really lasted, but it was partly because what it came with was respect for the viewpoint of everybody. They didn't go and criticize the people who did the internet Asifa, okay, in Citi Field. Instead, they came and they showed, like, wow, these men have a tremendous amount to offer. These are the leaders of the yeshiva world, the leaders of the Hasidic world. And there's nothing like modeling and showing people that things are more complicated than you think, and the world isn't in black and white. The world is in gray, and the truth lies in the gray. And I think, I know this is sounding a little bit not directly responsive to your question, but it was a cultural change that took place with all of that effort that I think. Does that a little bit address it?
Yes, I think it does. I don't think we're going to be able to fully resolve this issue about the steady erosion of what we call Das Torah, or the erosion of rabbinic authority and people who look to Rabbanim for guidance based on timeless Torah wisdom. And you said something very profound that we hear all again and again, especially in today's very postmodern society, is that we live in the gray. And it's a very uncomfortable position for so many younger people to be living in, because there's a craving, as you had started saying earlier in this conversation, for younger people to have parameters and boundaries, and to know what's okay and what's not okay. And to live in the gray is something that we learn to do as we get older and older. And you also had talked a little bit about anxiety, and I want to try and bring this all together if I can. One of the things that we are perceiving is that there does seem to be a greater level of anxiety. Part of it has to do with this FOMO, the fear of missing out, the feeling that I need to respond right away, as you had mentioned before. Part of the anxiety is due to COVID and the fact that because we're social animals and we haven't been able to interact, there's been some damage to our collective psyche, because we haven't had the social interaction that we actually crave, that's hardwired to our very being. This anxiety has manifested itself in a number of very unhealthy ways. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about, part of this anxiety manifests itself in this polarized, vociferous yelling at each other on social media, like we talked about before. But it also has to do with social interactions at the marketplace, where everyone who's I don't know is a stranger and an enemy, potentially. And the fear of the unknown, because we don't know what's just around the corner with COVID, what the next strain or the next iteration or the next shutdown, when that's going to be, God forbid. What do we do when we have anxiety, and how do we deal with anxiety? Is there a way? Is there an easy pill that we can take to help us when we're dealing with anxiety? We're not advocating escapism. We're not advocating taking a drink or smoking a joint. What can we do that's natural to help take a little bit of the edge off of our lives?
Yeah. If I could just give a simplistic answer, but it's, I think, at least to start, the way mental health people try to address anxiety is on three channels. Okay. One channel is the cognitive. You try to get a hold of the thoughts that are feeding the anxiety. Often in the case of anxiety around COVID, it might be, an awfulizing feeling like, this is horrible, things will never go back to normal. How am I ever going to get used to it? And a lot of self-statements that we're saying on the cognitive level that are either awfulizing or tyranny of the shoulds. It shouldn't be like this. Why can't I have a normal life? What happened to the, things that I always took for granted? So that's the cognitive. That's the Baal Shem Tov's B'makam shemachshavto shel adam sham hu nimtza haish. You want to know where the person is? Look at where his or her thoughts are. So that's on the cognitive channel. On the physiologic channel, which is, what happens to our bodies when we're anxious? Our hearts will race a little faster. Different people feel in different parts of their body. You may feel it in your GI system. You might feel a tightening in your neck. You might get a headache or whatever. But the physiologic is basically the natural response of the body to perceived threat. And there, this is where smartphones are, incredibly helpful, because there are amazing devices now that really teach mindfulness. There are two wonderful books on Jewish perspectives on mindfulness, which are amazing, written by psychologists who are also rabbis. There's but a number of apps. So you go onto commonsensemedia.com, which is a non-commercial site, and you just put in for the age group. Let's say you want to have anxiety management techniques for your kids, you can do it that way. You could find some basic mindfulness exercises for yourself. The most popular one has been Calm, CALM, which has a relatively small fee attached to it, but is excellent, and gives you specific mindfulness techniques for the specific issue that you're having. Is your problem with sleep? Is your problem with worry about work? Is your problem with parenting or whatever? And it gives you mindfulness, and it's a skill. It takes a while, but if you just do it a little bit at a time, simple breathing, normal breath in, slow breath out, can make an enormous difference. And then the final channel is the behavioral channel, where you actually respond to the anxiety by avoiding avoidance. You face what you're afraid of. You're nervous about going to shul because you've been away from it for so long. You push yourself to go back, or you're nervous about getting together with friends, or even if you're nervous about your anxiety about being too tough on your kids. You do that behavioral kind of intervention, and that could be extremely helpful at all. Two other quick points.
So could you just review those three once again?
Yes.
Number one.
Yes. Sure. So number one is cognitive. You think in a way, you catch the thoughts that are making you anxious, and you hold it up to the light of day in a rational kind of way, and that could really make a big difference. Okay. Physiologic is in terms of the normal breath in, slow breath out, mindfulness techniques, and there are all kinds of wonderful apps out there on it that make it more doable, but recognize it's not going to work right away. It's a skill that you have to do with time. And then the final is behavioral, which is to
push yourself.
Is to push yourself to avoid avoidance, etc. And then the other 2 points that have been found to really help with anxiety during COVID are ancient wisdom, and this is in every religion has this. One is the power of gratitude, to figure out a way to focus on what we have and to be thankful for what we have. And anytime we're able to be grateful that way, again, this is consistent with the Torah readings we have around now. It's the essence of being Jewish, Apam Odes Hashem, right? To be thankful. It helps us in a very basic way with our anxiety. So because you may not have control over, what new variant of COVID is coming, but you always have control over, being thankful for what you have in terms of your community, in terms of your family, in terms of friends, or whatever you have. And when you have that focus, it literally helps with your immune functioning, but helps mainly with anxiety. And then the other chesed is to be able, acts of loving kindness for others makes such an enormous difference, to be able to respond to everything that's going on with chesed. It's the antidote to the negativity of social media. Social media, by the way, could be a wonderful source for doing chesed. We now know about the suffering of people who may never have known about in the past.
Right.
Yeah.
And those last two items are so powerful. The ability to count your blessings and to recognize, I always try to tell my wife as often as I can, we are so blessed. Even when we're going through perhaps challenging times, but we are so blessed. And then just reminding oneself about all of the brachas of life is just so uplifting. And of course, emulating Hashem, the halachta b'drachav, is to emulate the Ribono Shel Olam by helping others, is extremely empowering. And this idea of imitating God as being a way of lifting ourselves up and alleviating anxiety, I can't think of a more powerful method than that. We are coming up close to the end of our discussion, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about one more issue that I think does contribute to some of the anxiety that especially our young people are experiencing today. It's no secret that from time to time, and Rabbi Pelkovitz, the amount of years that you've been in this line of profession, you've seen so many iterations, unfortunately, of communal scandals having to do with people in leadership positions, abusing that privilege and exploiting others because of their position. And this, of course, has created a significant amount of anxiety as well, especially among our youth. Could you just share with us a few thoughts on this topic and how we can restore the sense of joy and simchas hachayim in our lives?
Yeah, so you're talking about like when leadership fails,
Yeah.
point. Yeah. So
Mhm.
again, without without in any way identifying a specific person, because this is something that we're sometimes faced with. How do we talk to ourselves? How do we talk to our kids when there's when our leaders, who should be our moral leaders, disappoint us? And if I could just make a couple of points. The most important one in terms of talking to our kids is to be understood. First, understand. You go to your child and you ask him or her, what have you heard? Especially if you're in a neighborhood where there's been some kind of a scandal. And unfortunately, there are multiple scandals in different parts of the world. And if you're struggling with that now, you just ask them, what have you heard? And again, we don't necessarily know anything for sure. Sometimes there are situations where a person's been actually convicted, and it's still something that communities might be struggling with. But you ask your child, help me here. And very often they'll answer you in a way that'll will lead you towards what you need to talk about, what you need to understand. So that's number one. Number two is the idea, as a general rule of thumb, to help them have permission to talk about what's on their minds. Don't automatically reassure them. This is along the lines of what we talked about before. There's again the thought of "Ein adam omed al divrei Torah elam kein nichshol behem." We can't master anything in life without struggle. And this is something that, may bring with it struggle, because people who we've looked up to and were supposed to be the source of protection now may be in a very different kind of place. So we just need to let them know that it's okay to talk, and it's not disrespectful to talk. The Hebrew word ashrei, which is the highest level of happiness, is tied to the Hebrew word ishur, to validate. To validate what somebody's saying. And we do that for our children. It makes sense. And to name the monster, to talk, to the extent that you could allow them to talk about it, and to talk about whatever anger, and also to talk about how imperfection in general is something that is very much part of what we are sometimes faced with. Nobody's perfect. And I'm not saying this in any way to be an apologist for anybody who might later be found to be abusive, but just the idea of being able to give voice to values and to allow it. People underestimate the power of that. I have a colleague, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote a book that's been a best-selling nonfiction book over the last year, called "The Body Keeps the Score." One of the things he once showed me is he showed me the picture of the brain of one of his patients who was caught in the stairwell of the World Trade Center on 9/11. And he had an fMRI, a picture of that man's brain, as he was reliving the worst moment of his life. He was being crushed by the World Trade Center, miraculously managed to survive. And what he showed me is that the part of the brain that shuts off when people are faced with overwhelming kinds of stress is Broca's area, the language centers of the brain. But then what he showed me in subsequent scans over the coming months, that as he gave this patient words for his pain, as he helped him light up the language centers of the brain, and he helped him name the monster, that's where he was able to eventually come to a place where he was able to digest the meaning of what happened. And that's using an extreme example, but I see it all the time, how much good we do for ourselves and our children when we allow ourselves to name the monster and to see the area of growth that can come from these kind of struggles. And I'll just end with the following beautiful words of Chazal, which I often quote because it just makes me feel great. From the Medrash Tehillim, it says like this. It says, Ilu nafalti lokamti. If I never fell down, I never would have gotten up. Ilu yashafti bachoshech lo haya'arli. If I never sat in the darkness, I never would have appreciated the light.
Those are beautiful words. I think there's always going to be a tension between the importance of having heroes and role models in our lives, and at the same time, recognizing that even those heroic figures in our lives are human beings with flaws. I remember that one of the difficulties that I had as a bacher in yeshiva was having a Rebbe who I held in great esteem, and I thought he was like the person that I wanted to be. And then I saw him do something that sort of shattered my faith in him. It wasn't something so horrible, but it was just a flaw in his personality. And it was difficult for me as a young man to learn how to process that and put it in its proper context. And as we get older, I think we learn to live in that gray of recognizing that everyone is complex and no one is perfect. It's very difficult, I think, when we're younger, when we're teenagers or perhaps even younger than that, to know how to deal with people who were held in such high esteem, who provided us with such either inspiration, entertainment, Torah education, and then to learn that these people are not only deeply flawed, but perhaps possess a degree of evil that we could never see in ourselves. And we won't be able to resolve that issue. But as you say, the important thing is to open that discussion with our children, allow them to know that their voice is being heard, that it's okay to be disappointed, but that their belief in heroes should not be shattered because of one particular individual. That we should try to hold people that we feel are admirable, that their behavior is virtuous. We should use them as role models, with the caveat that even the greatest of people, the greatest of Gedolei Yisrael, will sometimes have flaws and foibles just like any other human being.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I just want to, I learn so much more in any time I spend with you, Dr. Pelkovitz. And I know that this has been very, very helpful to so many people who might be watching or listening. Thank you for being so generous with your time. Thank you for everything that Amudim is doing, including offering these special video seminars for people during perhaps a very challenging time for the Jewish people and for the world as a whole. As we begin to see the light emerge at the end of the tunnel, let's hope that talks like this will help us emerge as more healthy individuals. And please, Dr. Pelkovitz, please take the last words.
Well, just thank you for helping me think and helping me clarify. I always learn so much from your depth and your ability to talk about this. And thank you to Amudim. Amudim is an organization that I just keep getting more and more involved with Amudim because it's an organization that's involved in saving lives on a regular basis in a very real way, saving lives, and they're always there. And there's an ability to somehow keep growing and keep serving more and more people, and so that people don't have to feel alone in their struggles. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Amudim. Goodbye, everybody.